For 14 years, the name Eleanor had always been mentioned with exasperated headshakes at family dinners, but they had no idea she had just received a file that could strip away all their pride. The wind howling off Lake Michigan was particularly biting on this mid-November morning in 2025, throwing icy sheets of sleet against the heavy, reinforced glass windows of the Federal Building in downtown Chicago. Inside, however, the atmosphere was a sanctuary of controlled warmth, permeated by the comforting, rich aroma of dark roast drip coffee, the undeniable lifeblood of American bureaucracy. Sitting quietly at a neatly organized desk in the corner of the expansive IT audit department was Eleanor. At 32 years old, she possessed a quiet, unassuming grace that made her practically invisible to those who only valued outward appearances. She wore a simple, unbranded beige knit sweater, her chestnut hair pulled back hastily with a modest, inexpensive ribbon. There was not a single piece of flashy jewelry on her wrists, no designer watch or tailored blazer to signal any sort of elevated status. To a passing stranger, she might have easily been mistaken for a diligent, overworked intern fetching documents for the senior staff. Yet behind that humble, quiet exterior was one of the sharpest, most relentless analytical minds in the entire federal financial oversight agency. The rhythmic, rapid-fire clicking of her keyboard echoed softly in her cubicle. For Eleanor, that sound was profoundly familiar, yet historically painful. It was the very same sound that had once echoed through the grand hallways of her childhood home, triggering her father's booming reprimands. She could still hear his harsh voice echoing from the past, scolding her late into the night for staring at a useless, blinding screen, instead of studying to become a prestigious corporate lawyer or an esteemed surgeon like her older siblings. Her family had always measured a person's worth in Ivy League acceptance letters, country club memberships, and luxury cars, ultimately labeling her the family failure when she chose a different, quieter path. But right now, those nimble fingers were dancing across the keys, effortlessly decoding complex, encrypted financial ledgers. In less than 20 minutes, her serene eyes, reflecting the cool blue light of dual monitors, had successfully unraveled a highly sophisticated tax evasion scheme hidden deep within the offshore accounts of a massive corporate conglomerate. Just as she took a warming sip of her coffee, the sharp trill of her desk phone shattered her deep concentration. It was the chief inspector, a stern, uncompromising man in his late 60s with silver hair and a reputation for breaking the toughest financial criminals. He rarely called anyone into his office unless it was a matter of absolute urgency. When Eleanor stepped into his wood-paneled office, he didn't offer a polite greeting. Instead, he simply slid a thick, heavy folder across his polished mahogany desk. It was marked with a bright red classification sticker. Eleanor's eyes dropped to the bold black letters printed across the top of the dossier. Arthur and Sons. Her breath caught sharply in her throat, and her heart suddenly hammered violently against her ribs. Arthur and Sons. It was her father's company, the very empire he had built from the ground up, the prestigious institution he had haughtily declared she would never have the intellect or the proper pedigree to work for. The chief inspector cleared his throat, his sharp, calculating gaze softening just a fraction. He explained that the federal automated cross-check system had flagged massive, deeply concerning anomalies in the company's financial routing over the last decade. He knew her maiden name. He knew her family background. But he also knew that Eleanor was the only IT auditor in the division with the specialized algorithmic expertise required to trace these specific, highly obfuscated digital footprints. Returning to her desk, Eleanor felt the crushing weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. She gently closed the frosted glass door of her small office space, isolating herself from the low hum of the department. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up her cell phone and dialed the one person who always anchored her to reality: Lucas. Her husband was a quiet, profoundly steady man. Unbeknownst to her arrogant family, Lucas was a high-level financial strategist managing private equity funds with immense, quiet power. He never flaunted his wealth, preferring the simple, peaceful life they had built together away from judgment. When he answered, his deep, soothing voice instantly grounded her. Eleanor poured her heart out, explaining the agonizing dilemma sitting on her desk. She was completely torn. She could easily file a conflict of interest form, recuse herself, and let another inspector take the case. An inspector who would undoubtedly rip her family's legacy to shreds without a single ounce of mercy. Or she could step back into the toxic environment of the people who had entirely written her off, who had mocked her choices and exiled her from their opulent lives. Lucas listened intently, letting her release the years of pent-up hurt. When she finally paused, he spoke with gentle but unwavering conviction. He reminded her that her brilliant mind and her federal position were not weapons forged for petty revenge. They were tools meant to uncover the truth and protect the vulnerable. He told her that walking away wouldn't heal the old wounds, nor would it save her aging father from the impending federal wrath. If she took the case, she could at least ensure the investigation was fair, and perhaps, if they truly deserved it, find a legal way to mitigate the total destruction of her father's life's work. His words wrapped around her like a warm blanket on a freezing winter night. Eleanor took a long, deep breath, letting the scent of the roasted coffee center her spirit. The hesitation in her eyes melted away, replaced by an unbreakable, quiet resolve. She reached across her desk and picked up her favorite stainless steel fountain pen. With a smooth, decisive motion, she signed her name on the official federal authorization form. She wasn't doing this to gloat. She wasn't doing this to destroy them. She was stepping straight into the lion's den, no longer the naive, disappointing daughter they remembered, but the singular authority holding their absolute survival in her hands. She slipped the powerful federal badge into her frayed handbag, preparing to drive her beat-up Ford back to her hometown after 6 years of absolute silence. As Eleanor packs her federal badge and prepares to face the family that exiled her, the real storm is just beginning. If you're still captivated by her journey and find this story valuable, drop a number 8 in the comments below to let me know you're riding shotgun with us. And if you haven't already, I highly recommend hitting that subscribe button and turning on the notification bell so you don't miss the explosive chapters ahead. Your incredible support is what allows us to keep crafting these inspiring, high-quality stories for you. Now, let's dive right back in and see what happens when she arrives. The Thanksgiving dinner table was overflowing with roasted turkey and fragrant pumpkin pie, but the welcome Eleanor received was colder than the first snow of the season. Stepping through the grand double doors of the sprawling Arthur family estate, the stark contrast between the freezing Chicago night and the opulent, overheated foyer was immediate. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the polished marble floors, and the nostalgic scent of cinnamon, cloves, and roasting meat drifted from the massive gourmet kitchen. Yet, he didn't offer a hug of greeting. Instead, he gestured lazily toward the frosted front window, loudly boasting about the brand-new European sports car he had just parked in the circular driveway. He made Eleanor, they spoke, she didn't, he carved, he puffed, he chucked, the adult. Resting carelessly on that table was a thick leather-bound folder. A hard copy of Arthur and Son's internal financial summary that her father had evidently been reviewing before the guests arrived. Suddenly, one of her young nephews came sprinting through the room, loudly chasing the family dog. In his chaotic rush, the boy bumped hard into the side table. A tall glass of sticky cranberry juice tipped over, spilling a crimson tide directly across the open leather folder. A collective gasp echoed through the room as the adults rushed over. Instinctively, Eleanor grabbed a stack of thick linen napkins from the nearby bar cart and stepped forward to mitigate the damage. She moved swiftly, her practical nature taking over. As she leaned in, gently dabbing the dark red liquid off the crisp white pages, her highly trained eyes locked onto the exposed columns of raw, unfiltered data. Without the sophisticated digital encryption and firewall protections she had meticulously bypassed at the federal office earlier that day, the stark, unvarnished truth of the company's internal ledger was laid completely bare beneath her fingertips. The numbers painted a devastating, undeniable picture. Her mind, conditioned to spot anomalies in fractions of a second, instantly recognized the catastrophic pattern. It wasn't just a minor oversight, a clerical error, or a clever tax loophole pushed slightly too far. It was a massive, desperate hemorrhage of funds. She saw clear evidence of phantom accounts and a deeply reckless manipulation of corporate assets that went back over a decade. It was the desperate thrashing of a failing empire. It was far, far worse than the federal automated system had initially flagged, revealing not just systemic fraud, but a tragic, ruinous pride. Mr. Arthur's mocking words, "Don't touch that girl. You wouldn't understand a single number in there," echoed in the room, while Eleanor's mind had already finished calculating the prison sentence he could receive. At 9 o'clock on Monday morning, the steady click of high heels echoed through the grand lobby of Arthur and Sons. But the person walking in was not a failed daughter, coming to beg for a job. The corporate headquarters was a monument to old-world American wealth, featuring towering marble pillars, polished brass fixtures, and massive oil portraits of the company's founders lining the mahogany-paneled walls. It was an environment designed to intimidate, to make anyone who entered feel small and insignificant beneath the weight of the Arthur family legacy. But today, the air in the lobby carried a different kind of tension. Eleanor strode through the revolving glass doors with a quiet, undeniable authority. She was dressed in a sharp, impeccably tailored charcoal suit, a stark departure from the unassuming beige knit sweater she had worn over the holiday weekend. Flanked by two seasoned, stone-faced federal agents carrying heavy encrypted briefcases, she bypassed the lavish reception desk entirely. The security guards, accustomed to waving through local politicians and wealthy golf buddies, stepped forward to intercept the trio. But their protests died in their throats the moment Eleanor silently raised her gold-shielded federal badge. The memory of the sticky, crimson-stained pages from the Thanksgiving table now morphed into the harsh, undeniable reality of the task ahead. She led her small team directly to the executive financial wing, moving with a practiced precision that sent ripples of panic through the meticulously organized cubicles. When they reached the reinforced glass doors of the accounting department, the chief accountant, a perpetually sweating man in his 50s who had faithfully served her father for over 2 decades, hurried out to block their path. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project the same unyielding arrogance his employer always displayed. He glanced at the 2 tall agents, then looked down at Eleanor. Recognizing her from brief, dismissive family encounters years ago, a condescending smirk crossed his face. He actually dared to ask if she was lost or if her father had finally taken pity on her and offered her a low-level filing position in the mailroom. Eleanor did not raise her voice. She did not blink. She simply handed him the official federal warrant, complete with the indisputable seal of the United States Department of Justice. The color drained entirely from the man's face as his eyes darted from the heavy parchment back to the calm, piercing gaze of the woman he had just insulted. Without waiting for his permission, Eleanor bypassed him and instructed the agents to secure the perimeter. She walked straight into the company's main server room, a highly secure, climate-controlled vault bathed in stark, cold fluorescent lighting. The sheer drop in temperature was jarring, a physical manifestation of the chilling reality hidden within the humming towers of hard drives. The chief accountant scrambled in behind her, frantically stammering about privacy laws, unauthorized access, and how Mr. Zamio was currently on his way down from the penthouse office and would not stand for this outrage. Eleanor tuned out his desperate noise. She pulled up a heavy steel chair, sat down at the master terminal, and plugged in her federal bypass drive. Her fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with a blinding rhythmic speed. The company's IT department had set up a sophisticated array of digital smoke and mirrors, dummy ledgers, encrypted partitions, and fake offshore routing numbers designed to fool standard tax algorithms. To an ordinary auditor, Arthur & Sons looked like a pristine, perfectly managed corporate entity. But to Eleanor, it was a painfully transparent house of cards. Within 7 minutes, she systematically shattered their primary firewalls. The screen flickered, shifting from the sterile blue of the corporate dashboard to a cascading waterfall of raw, unfiltered data. The numbers glowed an angry, glaring red against the dark monitor. It was a complete financial hemorrhage. As she correlated the hidden files with the physical ledger she had accidentally seen on the holiday table, the tragic truth of her father's 15-year charade fully unraveled before her eyes. This was not the work of a brilliant, greedy mastermind hoarding illicit wealth. It was the desperate, reckless cover-up of an aging patriarch who had nearly bankrupted his empire during the 2010 financial crisis and had been illegally shifting funds ever since just to keep the lights on and preserve his fragile ego. The sheer magnitude of the tax evasion was staggering, carrying mandatory federal minimums that would undoubtedly guarantee her father would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. The man who had relentlessly judged her, who had cast her out for not meeting his impossible standards of success, was utterly ruined. A profound, suffocating silence fell over the server room, save for the rhythmic humming of the cooling fans. Eleanor reached out, her hand resting gently over the computer mouse. The cursor on the screen hovered patiently over the Upload to Federal Server button. Just one simple press of her index finger. That was all it would take to instantly transmit the encrypted evidence to Washington, lock the building down, and officially issue an arrest warrant for the man who had caused her so much pain. The power to destroy the Arthur legacy, to finally prove her worth in the most devastating way imaginable, was literally resting beneath her fingertip. Her finger froze right above the left mouse button as the server room door suddenly burst open, and Mr. Ian, Arthur's bewildered voice, rang out. "Eleanor, what on earth are you doing in the chief inspector's chair?" With her finger hovering just above that mouse, the tension in that server room is absolutely electric. If you're still completely captivated by this moment and finding value in Eleanor's story, please drop a number 1 in the comments below to let me know you're right here in the room with us. While you're at it, I'd love it if you could leave a meaningful comment or a kind wish for her as she faces this impossible choice. And if you haven't already, I highly encourage you to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Your incredible support is what helps us continue creating these inspiring, high-quality stories for you. Now let's jump right back in and see what happens next. The silence in the server room was thick enough to suffocate, leaving only the humming of the hard drives that were exposing the 15-year secret of a family. The sudden intrusion of her father's voice, sharp and demanding, shattered the heavy stillness. Mr. Arthur stood in the doorway, his chest heaving under his expensive tailored suit, his face a portrait of utter bewilderment and mounting rage. He demanded to know what kind of childish prank his estranged daughter was pulling, threatening to have the building's security physically remove her from the premises. He had always been a man who controlled every narrative, every room he entered, but this was a narrative that had already slipped entirely out of his grasp. Eleanor did not flinch, nor did she raise her voice to match his booming baritone. She calmly removed her federal bypass drive from the master terminal and silently gestured for him to step out of the freezing server vault and into the adjacent glass-walled executive conference room. It was nearly noon on a bleak Monday. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows, a fierce Chicago snowstorm had begun to descend, swirling thick, blinding white flakes over the city skyline. It was a stark, poetic reflection of the total chaos that was about to engulf the Arthur family legacy. As they entered the boardroom, the heavy mahogany doors burst open once more. Eleanor's older brother and sister stormed in, their faces flushed with indignation. Tipped off by the frantic chief accountant, they had rushed over to handle what they assumed was another one of Eleanor's embarrassing life choices. Her brother immediately began to shout, his voice dripping with the exact same cruel condescension he had used over the Thanksgiving turkey just days prior. He called her a profound disgrace, demanding she pack up her cheap briefcase and leave the building before they called the real authorities to have her arrested for corporate trespassing. Eleanor allowed them to vent their furious, misdirected pride for a long, agonizing minute. Then, moving with deliberate, practiced grace, she reached into her worn handbag. She didn't offer a dramatic speech or a bitter retort to their insults. She simply placed her heavy, gold-shielded federal badge squarely in the center of the massive polished oak table. Beside it, she set down her secure federal tablet, tapping the screen once to project the deeply classified audit summary. The brilliant, undeniable seal of the United States Department of Justice glowed on the display, illuminating the faces of her family. Beneath the seal, a terrifying waterfall of glaring red numbers documented the massive, undeniable tax evasion spanning over a decade. The transformation in the room was instantaneous and profound. The arrogant shouts of her siblings died in their throats, replaced by a suffocating, horrified silence. The color completely drained from her brother's flushed face, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound escaping. Her sister, usually so poised and deeply critical, gripped the back of a leather executive chair just to keep her trembling knees from giving out entirely. The devastating realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. The quiet sister they had relentlessly mocked for her thrift store sweaters and old car was not a failure. She was the lead federal investigator, and she held their absolute ruin in the palm of her hand. All the bluster and commanding presence vanished from Mr. Arthur. He stared blankly at the glowing red numbers, the irrefutable proof of his secret sins laid bare. The grand illusion of his untouchable empire shattered into a million jagged pieces. His broad shoulders slumped, and for the very first time in his life, he looked like a frail, incredibly old man. He collapsed heavily into one of the leather chairs, burying his face in his trembling hands, a broken patriarch facing the terrifying reality of federal prison. Standing at the head of the table, Eleanor looked at the data once more, her highly trained analytical mind seeing past the raw numbers and into the tragic human story hidden beneath. The stain of cranberry juice on the holiday ledger had merely hinted at this disaster. But as she traced the timeline of the fraud back to its exact origin during the brutal economic recession of 2010, a profound realization washed over her. He hadn't siphoned the money to buy luxury yachts or fund secret offshore accounts. He had illegally manipulated the funds to keep the factory doors open, to pay his loyal workers when the banks had completely turned their backs on him. The initial desperate lie had simply snowballed over 15 years into a massive, uncontrollable beast of pride and fear. It wasn't purely malicious greed. It was the tragic flaw of a man too proud to admit he was failing. Suddenly, a sharp mechanical beep echoed from Eleanor's federal tablet, cutting through the quiet despair of the room. A bright yellow digital timer materialized at the top of the screen, indicating a mandatory 48-hour automated lock. Because she had breached the primary firewalls and verified the anomalies, federal protocol dictated that the system would irreversibly transmit the final audit findings to the Central Bureau in exactly 2 days. Once that timer hit 0, automatic asset freezes and federal indictments would be instantly triggered. There would be no turning back, no backroom deals, and absolutely no mercy. The clock was ticking down relentlessly, a digital executioner waiting to strike. Looking at her aging father trembling and holding his head, Eleanor's fingers slipped off the send key. Could she find a legal loophole to save them without compromising her integrity as an inspector? The black coffee had gone completely cold on Eleanor's desk, while the digital clock mercilessly ticked every minute closer to the federal system's deadline. It was late Tuesday night, and the sprawling city of Chicago was entirely swallowed by a relentless, freezing winter storm. Inside Eleanor's modest apartment, the atmosphere was thick with an entirely different kind of storm. For years, her older siblings had privately scoffed at her living arrangements, assuming her small square footage and her stubbornly reliable rusted Ford were tragic, undeniable symbols of a failed life. They had completely failed to realize that her choices were never born of poverty, but of a profound, deeply ingrained practicality. She preferred a life free from the suffocating, performative weight of high society. Now, that exact same laser-focused practicality was the only shield standing between her aging, broken father and a devastating federal prison sentence. The second bedroom of her quiet home, converted long ago into a highly secure, state-of-the-art server sanctuary, hummed warmly with the immense processing power of her custom-built rigs. For over 36 grueling, agonizing hours, Eleanor had not slept a single wink. Her dark, weary eyes, framed by heavy shadows of exhaustion, rapidly tracked thousands of lines of complex digital code across 3 glowing monitors. She was not falsifying data or destroying evidence. To do so would completely compromise her own hard-earned federal integrity and destroy the career she had built from nothing. Instead, she was meticulously deconstructing 15 years of desperate, deeply flawed financial rooting. She was working tirelessly to separate her father's initial, panicked missteps from the systemic, gross incompetence of the company's highly paid accountants. By leveraging a highly obscure, yet entirely legal, corporate amnesty clause buried deep within the labyrinth of the federal tax code, she was restructuring the massive debt. If she could definitively prove that the funds were illegally diverted solely to sustain the factory payroll during the recession, rather than for malicious personal enrichment, she could legally convert the mandatory prison sentence into a massive, yet manageable, civil penalty. The soft, familiar creak of the hardwood floor gently announced Lucas's arrival. Her husband walked into the dimly lit room, carrying a fresh, steaming mug of chamomile tea. He placed it softly on her desk and rested a warm, grounding hand on her tense shoulder. Eleanor leaned back into his comforting touch, allowing the rigid tension in her neck to uncoil just a fraction. Lucas leaned over, his sharp, analytical eyes scanning the staggering sum required to initiate the federal amnesty protocol. It was a truly crippling number, a multi-million-dollar penalty that would instantly bankrupt Arthur and Sons if the government demanded it up front. Without a single word of hesitation, Lucas pulled out his personal, heavily encrypted terminal. The quiet, unassuming man her family had repeatedly dismissed as a low-level, uneducated clerk began effortlessly liquidating a fraction of his massive private equity portfolio. Within a matter of minutes, his quiet, hidden financial empire had legally secured the enormous cash escrow required to back her federal remediation proposal. It was a breathtaking, silent act of unconditional grace, freely offered to a family who had never shown him a single ounce of basic human respect. Suddenly, the harsh vibration of Eleanor's cell phone buzzed against the wooden desk, shattering the quiet intimacy of the room. The caller ID flashed her father's name. When she slowly swiped the screen to answer, the voice on the other end was nearly unrecognizable. Gone was the booming, commanding patriarch who routinely dominated boardrooms and casually belittled his youngest child over Thanksgiving dinner. In his place was a fragile, profoundly broken man, sounding every bit of his 72 years. Mr. Arthur hadn't called to beg for federal salvation. He hadn't called to manipulate her or leverage their shared bloodline. His voice cracked painfully as he spoke into the freezing Tuesday night. He called simply to apologize. For the very first time in 15 years, her proud father openly wept. He didn't apologize for the financial ruin or the impending collapse of his legacy. He apologized for his blinding, foolish pride. He tearfully expressed his deep remorse for constantly measuring her incredible worth by the brand of her coat, for dismissing her brilliant mind, and for systematically trying to crush the very spirit that was now working so tirelessly to protect him in his darkest hour. He told her how deeply ashamed he was that it took his absolute destruction to finally see the incredible, powerful woman she had always been. Eleanor closed her eyes, a single warm tear slipping down her pale cheek. She didn't offer a dramatic, grand speech of forgiveness. She simply whispered that she loved him and that he needed to get some rest. Hanging up the phone, she glanced back at the glowing yellow timer on her screen. Exactly 5 minutes remained before the federal system's automated lockout protocol would initiate. With a final decisive keystroke, Eleanor engaged the encrypted uplink, submitting the massive remediation portfolio and Lucas's certified escrow guarantee directly to the Department of Justice, officially requesting a freeze on the criminal indictments. The server screen spun in a circle, signaling the processing of massive data. Would the federal government accept this plan? Or was every effort simply too late? The snow finally blanketed the streets of Chicago in white, washing away the gloom of the stressful weeks and bringing a strange peace to the Arthur family estate. It was Christmas Eve, exactly 1 month after the terrifying digital countdown had threatened to permanently destroy their lives. The sprawling mansion, once a suffocating monument to rigid expectations and superficial wealth, now felt fundamentally different. The grand foyer was no longer a stage for arrogant displays of status. Instead, the air was deeply infused with the comforting, nostalgic scent of freshly cut pine, warm cinnamon, and roasted chestnuts. The massive dining table, which had served as a cold battlefield of condescension during Thanksgiving, was now arranged with the chairs pulled intimately close together. There were no boastful conversations about luxury sports cars or exclusive country club memberships echoing off the mahogany walls. The heavy, oppressive weight of pretense had been completely stripped away, leaving only the profound, humbling reality of second chances. Eleanor sat near the glowing stone fireplace, her hands wrapped comfortably around a warm mug of spiced apple cider. She wore her familiar, unassuming beige sweater, but tonight nobody in the room looked at it with thinly veiled disdain. Beside her sat Lucas, his quiet, steady presence radiating the same gentle strength that had financially anchored her federal remediation plan. The Department of Justice had formally accepted the massive escrow and the restructured debt proposal just hours before the holiday weekend began. Arthur & Sons would have to drastically scale down its operations, liquidating several luxury assets and significantly reducing its corporate footprint to pay back the government over the next decade. However, the criminal indictments had been officially frozen. No one was going to federal prison, and the terrifying storm had finally passed, leaving behind a profound sense of clarity and overwhelming gratitude. As the family gathered in the expansive living room beneath the softly glowing lights of the towering Christmas tree, Eleanor's older brother stepped forward. The arrogant, booming voice he had always used to dominate the room was completely gone, replaced by a quiet, sincere tremor. He stood before Eleanor and Lucas, entirely abandoning his deeply ingrained pride. With tears welling in his eyes, he formally apologized for his decades of cruel blindness. He admitted that he had spent his entire life desperately chasing a hollow, glittering illusion of success, completely failing to recognize the profound brilliance and quiet dignity of his youngest sister. Her older sister, standing closely beside him, echoed the exact same sentiment, her voice breaking softly as she asked for forgiveness. They acknowledged that Lucas, the man they had routinely dismissed, possessed more financial power and human decency in his quiet demeanor than their entire social circle combined. It was a breathtaking, incredibly raw moment of absolute surrender, washing away years of bitter resentment and deeply entrenched family prejudice. From the corner of the room, Mr. Arthur slowly rose from his leather armchair. He looked visibly older, the extreme stress of the past month having carved deep, permanent lines into his face, yet his eyes held a serene, peaceful light that Eleanor had never seen before. The heavy, suffocating burden of maintaining a perfect, untouchable empire was finally gone. He walked over to his daughter, his steps slow but deliberate. He cleared his throat, addressing the entire room, and officially announced his immediate retirement from the company. But before he stepped down, he had one final binding executive decision to make. He turned his gentle gaze toward Eleanor, formally asking her to accept the position of Supreme Oversight Advisor for Arthur & Sons. He didn't want her to run the daily operations. He wanted her unmatched integrity, her brilliant analytical mind, and her unyielding moral compass to guide the board of directors as they rebuilt the company the right way. Eleanor was deeply moved, her throat tightening with a sudden wave of profound emotion. But before she could answer, her father reached into the pocket of his tailored slacks and pulled out a small, beautifully wrapped box. He placed it gently into her hands, his weathered fingers trembling slightly. Eleanor carefully untied the velvet ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of soft cotton, was a slightly faded photograph. It was a picture of her from her college graduation day, smiling brightly in her cap and gown. She had always believed he had thrown this exact photo away in a fit of bitter disappointment because she hadn't graduated from an elite Ivy League institution. Looking up at him through a blur of warm tears, she realized the profound truth. He had never thrown it away. He had secretly kept it tucked inside his personal wallet for all these years, a silent, agonizing victim of his own tragic, stubborn pride. He had always loved her, even when he was completely blinded by his own deeply flawed definition of worth. The midnight toll of the church bell rang out, blending with the first joyous laughter of the Arthur family in over a decade. As the winter snow settled over the Arthur estate, a family once fractured by rigid expectations finally found their true wealth in the quiet strength of forgiveness. We often forget that the most profound power isn't found in a prestigious title or a bank account, but in our boundless capacity to show grace when it is least expected. When we finally set aside our harsh judgments of outward appearances, we open the door to genuine, life-changing compassion. As the author of this journey, I hope Eleanor's story reminds us that the most beautiful form of retribution against past hurt is simply unconditional kindness. If this story touched your heart today, please share its warmth with someone you cherish, and consider joining our gentle community here at Retribution Raw, as we continue to uncover the raw, authentic truths of the human spirit together.